Dobry dzień. Mnie звати Raya Dzulyńska. My name is Raissa Dzulynsky. Today I'll be interviewing Marta Dyczok, our fifth alumni of the Alumni video series. Marta is a professor of history and political science at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Dyczok specializes in international politics and history with a focus on East Central Europe and Eurasia, and specifically Ukraine. Her research interests are on the politics of history, mass media, migration, post-communism, and World War II. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The first question is, where did you go to university and what did you study?
Well, I went to 3 universities. I started off at the University of Toronto, where I got my bachelor's degree in international relations and Ukrainian language and literature. So I got a double major. And then I went to do my master's degree at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science in England. And that was in international history. And from there, I went to do a PhD in modern history, and that was at St. Antony's College at Oxford University. So those were all the things that I studied.
Wow, very well educated. What was your involvement in SUSK?
Well, SUSK, I got involved in, first I got involved in with USK, which was the Ukrainian Students Club at the University of Toronto, and I was an undergrad there. And from then later became involved with SUSK. And I think it was in my first or second year. I have an older sister, so she was in university ahead of me. So she taught me, she told me about a lot of things, and I think she told me about USK, that this is a really good club to join, because when you start university, you're there to learn, but learning in the classroom, the mathematics, the history, all that sort of stuff, that's one kind of learning, but being involved with extracurricular activities is another kind of learning. So everybody was, of my generation anyway, looking for interesting clubs to join. And this Ukrainian Students Club was one that was very active at U of T at the time. And I became involved, and then I became part of the executive, and then I got involved with SUSK. And then later ended up, I think it was in my final year of my BA, had this idea to recreate not just a national, at the national level, but this international network of Ukrainian students, which was, I read about it in one of my history courses. It was called SUSQUE, Центральний Союз Українського студентства, that had been defunct for a long time. And I thought, let's set this up again. So I got this grant from the federal government and reached out to all these people all over the world. And we had this Congress in Toronto, at the University of Toronto in Hart House, of all places, of course. And students came, like student representatives came from all sorts of countries. European countries, the student movement was a little more sort of more developed, Australia, but the really cool country was Brazil. And I don't actually remember how I found Brazil, but somehow I connected with the Ukrainian community in Brazil, and they put me in touch with the student organization. And I reached out to this person, I didn't know any of these people, and his name was Oscar Jairo de Nascimento. And I sent him an invitation, and he came. And he came all the way from Brazil to this conference, and we have stayed in touch. We're still friends. He was actually in touch with me just the other day, because he was saying, it was 35 years ago that I went to this Congress in Toronto of students. So he's still very active in the Ukrainian community in Brazil. And I interviewed him for this radio show that I used to do for Hromadske Radio. And it was this weekly English language show that I did on various topics. And one week, this was a few years ago when the Olympics were in Rio, I thought, I know somebody in Brazil. So I interviewed him for the radio show, and that's going to be, that interview's going to be in the book that's coming out of these radio shows. But that's kind of a long answer to the question of how did I get involved with SUSK, and now I sort of went off on a longer tangent. So I don't know if you wanted to sort of go back to some of the other questions, because you have a nice questionnaire prepared.
No worries, that was really interesting. Yeah, I'll continue with the questions, but obviously if you've covered anything, you can just talk about something else, or we'll keep going. So my third question was, what was your involvement in your USO?
That is the local club, yeah?
Yes, the local club.
Well, as I said, that was my entry point into SUSK. And The things that I was most interested in at that point in my life were human rights issues. And there was, I mean, it was still the Soviet Union, so there were still political prisoners. And I remember also being very active in Amnesty International. And so the Ukrainian Students Club, we had a human rights representative, and I became involved in that area. And then at some point, I think I actually became, I don't remember all the titles that I had, but I know that I was doing things in that. So I may have been like the human rights person for SUSQ. And that what was really important for me and still is connecting issues that are of interest to me that are Ukraine related with other organizations. So we did joint staff with like Amnesty International. So those, you know, back in the day, it was like letter writing campaigns to have political prisoners released, to have individuals named as prisoners of conscience, compiling information about, you know, the horrible things that were being done to them, consciousness raising, so various events on campus that we would organize about, you know, just to let the broader university community know. Because like today, there are people who really are still waiting to be informed about certain things. So, yeah.
And it's unfortunate that you know, SUSK. I mean, we're happy we were able to participate, but in the Postcards for Prisoners campaign, that even now we still have, there are still Ukrainian prisoners, and
Mm-hmm.
people still don't know about it, and there's still a need to educate and help. My next question, and I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but feel free to expand, is what is your current occupation?
Well, I teach history and political science at the University of Western Ontario. I am also a fellow at the Ptroyatsi program for the study of contemporary Ukraine at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs. And I am adjunct professor at the National University of the Kiev Mill Academy. So that keeps me pretty busy. I also have a huge interest in journalism. So while I was doing my PhD, when I was a graduate student at Oxford, my PhD was about World War II refugees and displaced people from Ukraine. So I was doing all sorts of archival work in England, in the United States, and France, but also I wanted to go to the Soviet Union because that's where the archives were, the Soviet archives. And this was still the Soviet period, and I had to go through these formal academic exchanges. So I had to apply for this Canadian academic, Soviet academic exchange because it had to go through your citizenship. Very complicated because I was studying at Oxford, but I was a Canadian citizen, wanted to go to the Soviet Union. This was before internet, so everything happened by snail mail. But anyway, it all worked out, and I went on this exchange, and I landed in Kyiv in March of 1991. Not knowing, of course, what would happen 6 months later, right?
Wow.
Because I went there to do archival research. And as you know, the Soviet Union started falling apart. There was a coup. Anyway, I decided to get myself a job as a journalist because I thought these archives, they're not going anywhere. And I am watching history unfold around me. So I got in touch with various newspapers, and The Guardian hired me as a stringer. And so I started reporting for the newspaper, the Guardian. And things started heating up. The coup happened. There were four journalists in Ukraine at the time because there was only 10 of us, but most people went off on vacation because it was August. And those of us who stayed in Kyiv, it was like, oh, what are you going to do in the city? There was a music festival happening in Zaporizhia, the Chervona Ruta festival. And I said, you guys, let's go to this music festival. So we did. And then, of course, the coup happens while we were in Zaporizhia. And the trains stopped running, the planes, like everything got stuck. So we hired a taxi to drive us from Zaporizhia to Kyiv because we had to get back to the capital. And anyway, I'm telling you about what would be working as a journalist. So anyway, I worked as a journalist for a while and then went back and finished my PhD and published it and got a job. But I still love journalism. And so occasionally I still do, various reports. And I study media in Ukraine. So that became one of my research topics and just finished a big chapter that's going into this collection. So very excited about that. This is a book called From the Ukraine to Ukraine. and it's coming out next spring, and it's looking at 30 years of Ukrainian independence, and it's an edited collection of various scholars writing on different topics. And the chapter on mass media I've co-wrote with Marta Dyczok, who's one of my research collaborators in Ukraine. So that's kind of writing about the events that I lived through and participated in. But some people that I know created this independent radio station called Hromadske Radio. And they started reaching out to me because during the Euromaidan, there was a lot of interest in what was happening and how things looked from Ukraine. So Irina Slavinsky, she wrote to me and she said, oh, can we interview you? What does Canada think about what's going on? And I said, oh, she said, can I record this interview? And I said, sure. And then one of the co-founders, Andriy Kulakov, got in touch and said, can you do this for us in English? Because we want to do some English language stuff. So I started doing some podcasts for them, and then I started doing this show. So I occasionally still do journalism, and I really, really enjoy that. So that's
really cool.
Kind of some of the things that I do.
Yeah. I mean, it's cool that you were able to be in Ukraine during that time.
Oh, well, the 1990s, yeah, that was like the most exciting thing that ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, when you study Ukraine, there's always excitement, right? Like it's never a dull moment. It's just a question of more exciting or less exciting. So
whether you want that excitement or not, it's positive or negative.
That's a good point. I think a lot of my friends and colleagues in Ukraine, they're like, yeah, we want less excitement. We want boring.
So my next question is, how do you think SUSK helped you in advancing your career and or personal development?
Well, I would say that SUSK is an excellent network because through my activities in SUSK, I met a lot of different kinds of people. And joining SUSK for me was not about career progression. That was about sort of becoming involved both socially and in terms of activism through a Ukrainian venue, because I also did other things, but this was my Ukrainian kind of outlet. But through SUSK, I got to meet people who were studying different things. And through serendipity, that ended up affecting some of the choices that I made. And for example, when I started university, when I was first year, I wanted to be an art historian. And that's the program that I enrolled in. And I got to U of T, was all excited, and I kept falling asleep in lectures. And I thought, oh man, I made a huge mistake here. And then I met this guy, Roman Lizhnik, who was in SUSK, and he was doing pre-med. But he told me about other programs that he said, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? And I ended up switching to international relations because I thought, I better pick something that's going to be interesting for me, because I thought art history would be fun. And I love art and I love history, but that was not the good choice. But anyway, so Lizhnik told me about IR, and then I ended up taking that. And then he also told me about this program in Slavic languages and literature, which I had not even thought about doing. And he said, well, take a look at some of those courses. And I did, and I ended up doing first a minor, and then I liked it so much that I ended up doing a double major. And some of the people that I met through USK and later SUSK, I'm still in touch with. Someone like, and again, these people are from different disciplines, because Lizhnik, he was doing pre-med, he's now a medical doctor. And somebody else that I remember just working with in USK and SUSK, Danilo Bilak, who became a lawyer and now works in Ukraine. And he also, I interviewed him for my radio show recently, and we just occasionally stay in touch because he's also involved somewhat in Ukrainian studies. Mike Buzurkin, he was president of SUSK when I was, I can't remember my positions, but that era. And then, again, we stayed in touch. And then I was in Ukraine because I go there every summer to do research. And he was the spokesperson for the OSCE, the Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. So I would bump into him at press conferences. And one year, as it turns out, his birthday, he was in Kyiv for his birthday. So I ended up, all these years later, being able to go to his birthday party. So, you meet people. Raissa is another person who I met through SUSK. Andrei Hluchovetsky, who I haven't been in touch with that much recently, but we were in touch for quite a while. So it's like you build a network of people that give you ideas and you end up working with them at some point in the future.
And I definitely agree. Like, for example, like our executive this year, and I've now been on the executive for 4 years, it's from all across Canada. And like previously, I met people through like Plostovi Tabore, but it's a different type of relationship you have when you work with these people, when you kind of run activism projects with these people, than if you go to a Tapir. And it's, they're both great different types of relationships, but it's definitely been a great way to meet people from across Canada, people that are interested in similar things to me, kind of on the Ukrainian front.
Yeah, and it's I like the interdisciplinary kind of thing and the geographic distribution, like you said, because you meet people from all over the country that you otherwise wouldn't have. I just thought of another person I met, Jeff Stefaniuk, who is he became a priest and he lives in Saskatoon. And we were, again, on the executive together, and he's someone who I've stayed in touch with. And one of the projects I'm working on is I interviewed this young man who joined a volunteer battalion, a guy called SUSQUE, and I'm writing up his biography. And as it turns out, Jeff is doing something very similar, Father Stefaniuk, I should say. He's helping translate the memoirs of a volunteer. So we were connecting about very similar kind of projects all these years later. So it's it's a nice network, and it's like the later version is like the Shevchenko Scientific Society and the Esh Canada, which I'm also on the executive of. So that's sort of when you finish being a student and all that, that's the next network, because again, it's people from all over the country, different disciplines. And so you learn and you connect and grow in lots of different ways.
For sure. So my last question is, do you have any tips for current students? And these tips can be related to SUSK, the Ukrainian community, or just general career tips.
Well, how much time do we have? Because I could give you tons and tons of advice. But
as much as you want.
Oh, okay. Well, that's dangerous. Let's keep it focused. I think my number one piece of advice, and this is for everybody always, is follow your heart. You have to make choices based on what feels right and balance that with your head. So just always balance, what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Because often, especially when you're in university, whether it's the undergrad or graduate level, you have to make choices, and you get a lot of advice from a lot of different people, and sometimes it's hard to decide what to do. And sorry, that's my phone. I'm just gonna call them back later. So listen to all the advice that you get and seek out as much information as you can. But in making decisions, always follow your heart. So that's my number one piece of advice, whether it's choosing an essay topic or choosing a career or whatever it is that you're doing. The second piece of advice is going to sound really boring, but just always do the best you can. Because sometimes people take shortcuts. They say, oh, well, this will be good enough. Don't do that. Just always do your best. And the third piece of advice is have fun. Because everybody who's in university works really hard. And when you graduate, you work really hard. But if you like what you do, you enjoy it, which is my life. I mean, I love my job. I love my profession. I love what I do. And I do have a lot of fun with it. So, I mean, I always do the best I can, but I also remember to have fun. And my class is writing an exam today. They're already writing it now. But I threw in a fun question, and I'm dying to see how many of them will get it. Because it's like, what's going to be the fun question? And we'll see.
Okay, дуже дякую. It was great to hear from you, and I'm sure others will enjoy hearing about your experience as well. Slava
Oh,
Ukraini, heroям slava.
thank you so much for having me, and stay focused and keep up the great work, because you guys are doing an amazing job with SUSK and USK. And just a little plug to all of you guys who've been doing the Holodomor awareness stuff, because you know that I'm sometimes involved with the students club at the University of Western Ontario, and you guys are doing wonderful things, but that is the best. That's the sort of the consciousness raising and the raising awareness, that you guys are doing such a great job with that, whether it's in that UCC space or with the bus coming or with those special events. So I think that's really an area where that's a major thing. The other thing that you guys obviously are very involved in is the situation with the war in Ukraine, because that is slipping off the agenda, and that needs to be, you know, people need to be reminded that there's a war going on. So anyway, on that happy note, thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.